Okay, so funny story. On our last day before work, before the holiday break, my coworker was like, so what are you going to do over the holidays? And I'm like, nothing. And she's like, I thought you were going to say you were going to go visit graveyards. And I was like, actually, that is part of my plan.
Oh my goodness.
Because that's actually right on. And today I'm going to tell you about one of my favorite graveyards in LA. Probably my favorite graveyard in LA. But it's a place with a lot of duality, has a complex history. The guy who made it, if you look at a lot of literature, he's kind of lauded as a real good guy, but all humans are complex humans, and we're going to explore some of the complexities around a place that is referred to as the Disneyland of Death. This is the Forest Lawn Glendale Cemetery.
Oh, where Michael Jackson is buried.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find the real truthful information because Forest Lawn is a huge corporation. They make a lot of money, and they want to make sure that their public image is squeaky clean, right? So a lot of the info I got for this comes from a out-of-print book called The First Step Up Towards Heaven, Hubert Eaton and the Forest Lawn by Adela Rogers St. John's. And this author, she is fantastic. She's also a screenwriter for a long time. She's so funny. Her writing is so good. They don't do writing like this anymore. So I'll drop a link to where you can read the book online at the Internet Archive. But she's also buried in Forest Lawn, Glendale, at the Great Mausoleum in the Columbarium of Memory niche. So like her cremated remains are in there. And she starts the book to give you an idea of her sense of humor. She says, when I was 8 years old, I lost my belief in immortality because they wouldn't let me wear my red dress to my grandfather's funeral.
Wow.
I love that.
So how old was she when she died?
She was born in 1894 to 1988.
So that place has been around for a long time.
Yes. So Forest Lawn Glendale was established in, I have it written down here, 1906 about.
Wow.
But we're going to talk about the guy who took it from this like little kind of scraggly graveyard and turned it into this whole thing, which actually changed the way that funerals and memorial services and cemeteries were done.
And that was there before the one in Burbank.
Yeah, so Hubert Eaton, I'm going to tell you the whole story of how he got the idea for Forest Lawn Glendale and then how it spread to all these forest lawns that are everywhere.
I didn't know that they were everywhere.
Yeah, they're everywhere. They're Hollywood Hills.
Isn't this the
Forest Lawn? Yeah, it's kind of that was made after the Forest Lawn Glendale.
Okay,
and then there's other ones just all over the place. So another resource that I'll link in the show notes is a blog post called "Reckoning Racism and Resistance in Glendale." So let's begin. Hubert Eaton was born on a farm in Liberty, Missouri, June 3rd, 1881, and I looked up his astrology. He's a Gemini with a sun approaching the South Node. The South Node deals with endings, and Venus conjunct Saturn in Taurus, and in fact he's got a whole stellium in Taurus, big Taurus energy. So if you think about Venus, beauty, Saturn, death, rocks, stone, permanence, that's his vibe, right? But also he's got that Gemini element, so he goes through lots of changes in his life before he settles down and is the manager of this huge cemetery empire that eventually he develops. 2 years before Hubert was born, across the border in Indian Territory, which would become Oklahoma in 1907, a member of the Cherokee Nation named Will Rogers entered the world. And 50 years later, in 1935, Hubert Eaton would be in California giving Will Rogers one of the most beautiful funeral services at his Forest Lawn Glendale Cemetery. One of the most beautiful services the country had ever seen, hugely widely publicized. Now, let's talk about the environment that Hubert was born into. Post-Civil War, Missouri was a rough place. During the war itself, Missouri was hotly contested as a border state, and that part of Missouri especially saw a lot of bloodshed with Confederate secessionist guerrillas engaging in raids. Atrocities are being committed. Pro-Confederate bushwhackers during the Civil War went house to house executing Union sympathizers. And so after the war, Missouri was deeply divided among three bitter factions. So we have the Unionists, the conservative unionists who advocated for racial segregation, and then the pro-slavery ex-Confederate secessionists. And for former Confederates, legislation temporarily excluded them from voting, serving on juries, becoming corporate officers, or preaching from church pulpits. So these folks who are extremely racist are feeling a lot of ways about seeing former slaves
in
voting,
doing normal things in life that they were blocked from doing.
And they're really angry at the feds, who are actually, for the first time ever in American history, actually doing what they need to be doing, which is passing legislation that gives former slaves rights and lets them vote. That didn't last for long because, in 1889, the first wave of poll taxes is going to get passed. And you have to pay to vote, or you have to, people are subjected to a lot of intelligence tests in order to vote. This is what they would do. If you were a black person who went to the polls to vote, they would hold up a jar of marbles or coffee beans and say, how many coffee beans? It was really, really bad. So that's basically why after the Civil War and after the 14th Amendment passes, and then after these laws get passed to allow former slaves to be citizens and vote, then it took until the Civil Rights Act of 1965 for actual representation.
I just saw Selma.
Oh, okay.
I hadn't seen that before. I was slow to that, and that should be in every school, speaking of that subject.
Yeah.
Every school should be. I don't know how I never saw it up until now.
Yeah.
So that was around that time period.
Yeah. But you have to imagine, Missouri is an just especially volatile place because you've got former slave owners. You've got people who fought for the Union. You got people who fought for the Confederacy. People who are I'm for the Union, but I'm extremely racist, and I don't think black people should be voting or have any rights.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So they're passing early Jim Crow laws. There's segregation, and horse-drawn streetcars, in fact, in St. Louis didn't allow black passengers, and there was a very early Montgomery bus boycott thing happening where the streetcars were boycotted. This guy named Charlton Tandy led a boycott. He even took hold of the horses' reins and stopped the horses and didn't let them go on until they allowed the black passengers to go on. So it was a really, really awesome moment, but there was also a lot of reaction to that was very negative. Jesse James is a really good example. I love an outlaw. You love an outlaw. Yeah. Jesse James, he's not the guy that we need to be loving.
No.
He really took advantage of the post-war Missouri, and he was in fact born in the same county as Hubert Eaton, this guy who we're going to talk about, who made Forest Lawn. There's a lot of people in Missouri who are very upset about the woke cancel culture that the federal government are making us give people rights. And Jesse James is becoming a folk hero because every time he commits a crime, people are like, yeah, Jesse James, sticking it to the man. What are your thoughts?
Well, I just think there was, especially back then, when you lived in a time where you didn't have phones and Google and TV and even radio.
Yeah.
Story and storytelling was the way everyone was entertained. So just looking back in history, who knows on a lot of this stuff? Because even newspapers in those days got things wrong all the time and printed stuff that weren't verified. At the end of the day, though, he wasn't the hero that everybody thought he was. At times, people loved him.
Yeah, people loved him.
He had his fans. He had a cult following.
They were singing in Clay County, Missouri. They were singing songs about him.
Yes, I remember reading that.
But the thing is, why people loved him was because they were extremely racist and they were angry at the federal government for making them give black people rights. And so Jesse James represents this extremely racist ideology. And the people who are fans of him, just look into that history, right? So Hubert's father was one of the people who was very anti-crime, anti-Jesse James. And in fact, he was teaching at the college that was founded by Jesse James's father, who was a very religious man, who then went into California during the gold rush to preach to people, but he died of sickness over there. So that's why Jesse James grew up without a father. And in fact, this guy, Hubert Eaton's father, once passed Frank James in the street while he was in the midst of his crime spree. And Hubert Eaton's father was like, your father was a very good Christian man. You know, he was one of those guys.
He said that to Jesse James?
He said that to Frank James.
To Frank James.
Jesse James's brother.
Brother.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So Hubert Eaton's father and mother, they were older than typical. His father was 47 when Hubert was born. He had a PhD, taught natural sciences at the university, and his mother was 38. So
that's up there for those days.
Very interesting. And he was ordained, and he was kind of a strict father, very Christian, very into education. And in fact, Hubert's brothers died before Hubert was born. So I kind of imagine Hubert going to the local cemetery, which was packed because Civil War, a bunch of people dying from crime, just a really bloody area.
Yeah.
And it being a very depressing cemetery, and also seeing the graves of his little brothers who died before he was born. Literature was also a very important part of Hubert's life. His mother read him poetry to him and his sister, and she believed in having visions, and that's going to play an important role in the development of Forest Lawn Cemetery as well. Hubert's father, though, had really the strongest influence. He, like I said, very strict, very religious, fire and brimstone, church twice on Sundays, prayers every night, you know, that sort of guy. And he actually ended up dying when Hubert was 16 because he went over to visit the Holy Land and made a little stop in Cairo, got really sick randomly, and just died in Cairo.
Wonder what he had.
Yeah, I have no idea. So this is 1897.
Okay.
So we'd have to research what was going on there. But gosh, you know, there was waves of diseases constantly everywhere, you know. Hubert went on to study science in college, and then he had a wide range of jobs. According to the biography, he punched cattle in Montana. He assayed copper in the Anaconda laboratories, quelled riots in Mexico, and eventually he went on to make $1 million in a Nevada silver mine, only to immediately lose it right away.
How did he lose it?
So he bought the silver mine, and then things were good. He was going to make a bunch of money on it, and then he had investors or something, and then he goes down into the silver mine, and for some reason the vein or whatever it is that you get silver from, I don't know how it works, was just gone. And so he lost all that money. And then at some point he makes it out to Southern California.
And how old is he at this period-ish?
So he's
young still.
He's still very young. Yeah. Before his 30s, he's doing all that. And now let's cut to 1914. A film director named D.W. Griffith.
Oh, yes, I know about him.
Has acquired the rights to a novel and play that was published in 1905 called The Klansman. And as the title indicates, this is a play and novel about the KKK's rise to power during the Reconstruction era. Yeah. And it's about how terrible it is that all these freed slaves are going around the country chasing after white women, you know, being elected to Congress, and the mayhem, according to this book.
And isn't it interesting? We're sitting here at my house, which is part of Griffith Park.
Well, no, Griffith Park is not named after D.W.
Oh, I thought it was. There's something around here named after him.
Griffith Park is named after Griffith Jenkins Griffith.
Oh, I need to do my homework.
Is a different guy, but who shot his wife.
Oh, dear. They're interchangeable fucks.
That's a whole story.
But there's something here named after D.W. because of all his mystery involving his life.
There is a middle school named after D.W. Griffith, which I think got its name changed finally after 2020.
Yeah.
That middle school had its name D.W. Griffith for like a long time.
I remember that.
And the early Directors Guild Award was the D.W. Griffith Award.
the D.W. Griffith Award. I do remember that.
And still, though, everyone in the film industry regards D.W. Griffith as the father of film, because Birth of a Nation, which is the film that we're going to talk about in a second, was the first film to, have its own score, was the first film that was shown in the White House, and it was the most profitable film of all time.
It was revered.
It made, in today's money, over $1.6 billion. And it was about the KKK's rise to power, and it depicted black characters, but black characters in blackface, acting just awful. And it's all about, oh, these poor white people. Oh, these poor white women being victimized by these freed slaves. It's awful. It's like the worst thing. And
I've never seen it. Have you seen it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we watched it in film school.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, it's awful. And, they show the KKK on their horses riding towards the camera, and the Flight of the Valkyries is playing, and it's all very like, look at these heroic Klansmen. Like, that's the film.
Wow,
And
I didn't know that.
yeah.
But he is D.W. Griffith in history. If you look it up, you see about him as a filmmaker. Nothing more, really, unless you dig deep.
He chose The Klansman, a book called The Klansman,
Right,
to make into one of the most important films of all time. So that lets you know right away who he is.
Right.
So anyone who's like, oh, separate the art from the artist, no. And I'm going to talk about with Forest Lawn Cemetery, separate the art from the artist. No, you don't, because D.W. Griffith fought to make this film happen because he believed in it. The president at the time was like, this film was written in lightning. And anyone who's like, oh, well, that was just the sentiment at the time. No, it wasn't. No, there were protests of this film. This was a hugely racist film.
Yeah.
And so anytime we laud it as like, oh, this is the beginning of filmmaking, we should laud it as, well, isn't that interesting that we've chosen this film that is extremely racist to be this pinnacle of filmmaking white people? But the reason I bring this up is because this film, an important scene in it, the Siege of Petersburg Civil War battle scene, was shot in this piece of land about 6 miles north of Los Angeles. It's got patches of devil grass and pepper trees and eucalypti, and there's a little unpainted shack and some granite headstones, and it's a little city that's about 600 acres, and it's called Tropico. And this little city is known for its strawberries called Tropico Beauties. And Tropico even has its own little station on the Southern Pacific Line, and there's a little interurban trolley that goes to it. And this is the site of Forest Lawn Glendale. And this is where Hubert Eaton is going to come over here.
And how big was it?
At the time that it was the first Forest Lawn Cemetery, I want to say it was like 13 acres.
Okay, and you can see it from the freeways when you're driving over that way.
Yeah.
You can see the big, I guess it's a large crypt.
Yeah, it was really, really small. So Birth of a Nation is released, and a year after its release, Hubert Eaton, who had recently lost $1 million in mining, he engaged in some financial finagling and got the backing of some rich relatives and a local real estate speculator, and he purchased a majority stake in this graveyard where Birth of a Nation was shot. It's been a cemetery since 1906, and Hubert actually owned part of it starting in 1912, but he hadn't even come to California yet. And in 1916, that's when he took over management and became personally invested in selling the plots. And soon after, the city of Tropico, where this is taken place in, becomes part of Glendale, and so did this graveyard called Forest Lawn.
How did the name come up, Forest?
It was already named
that. It was already named that.
Yeah.
Okay, so he didn't create that.
Yeah. And let's take a momentary scene jump, though, to what life is like for Glendale residents who weren't like Hubert Eaton and D.W. Griffith, folks who were not white. Let's meet Dr. Alva Garrett, who was Los Angeles' first African-American dentist. And I'm picturing Jacob Anderson in this role. He's born in Montgomery, Alabama, and studied pharmacy and dentistry at Howard University. He moved to Los Angeles in 1901. In 1907, Dr. Garrett's wife, Lily, is suffering from a terrible medical condition, and the family has to move from Los Angeles into temporary housing in Glendale. And I don't know if that's to be closer to the medicine that she needed, or if she needed like more open space away from smog. I don't know, but they moved to Glendale. And several months after his arrival, Dr. Garrett receives a letter addressed to the only colored man in Glendale, warning the family they would suffer consequences if they did not move immediately. Unable to relocate due to his sick wife, Dr. Garrett and his family maintain a 24-hour-a-day vigil over their home, protecting it even though they are absolutely terrorized. The family stays for 9 years as the only Black family in Glendale until Lily dies in 1916. In 1916, Lily is interred at Forest Lawn since Dr. Garrett had purchased burial plots for their family when the cemetery was first founded back in the early 1900s. And it seems like since they pre-bought burial plots, they should be all good.
You would think.
Right? The whole family's set. They're all going to be buried there. Yeah. Hold that thought, because we'll come back to them. Let's go to Hubert Eaton, who he's standing upon this land where Birth of a Nation was shot. This is his cemetery that he owns. And it's actually January 1st, 1917. There's a little gate there at the Forest Lawn Cemetery. It kind of looks like a dragon's back. It's kind of like an arch of stone, and it's got these little tufts of palm trees on either side, tumbleweeds, kind of barren, depressing acres. Hubert's in his 30s. Everything he's done so far in life has failed. Today, it's hot. He's wearing a blue suit. He's thinking about his life. The Pasadena Tournament of Roses parade is happening a few miles over.
When did that start?
They didn't have the Rose Bowl.
Okay.
They had the tournament arena, which is where they had their
parade.
Hubert's supposed to have kind of blue eyes, but I'm picturing Andrew Garfield in this role. It's in this moment on New Year's Day in 1917 that Hubert, thinking about life, he thinks about poetry because his mother always had him read poetry. And he recalls a passage from the agnostic writer Robert Greene Ingersoll, who says, "Help for the living, hope for the dead." And he has this vision. It's going to be a park not dedicated to death, but to eternal life. And he does what his father always told him to do when he had ideas. He writes that down on a piece of paper. And he writes his creed, his idea. And he says, "I believe in a happy eternal life." And also he writes, "I therefore prayerfully resolve on this New Year's Day, 1917, that I shall endeavor to build Forest Lawn as unlike any cemetery, as sunshine is unlike darkness, as eternal life is unlike death. I shall try to build at Forest Lawn a park devoid of misshapen monuments and other customary signs of earthly death, but filled with towering trees, sweeping lawns, splashing fountains, singing birds, beautiful statues, cheerful flowers, noble memorial architecture, with interiors full of light and color, redolent of the world's best history and romances. I believe these things educate and uplift a community." And he'd never written anything like that
before.
That was
pretty profound.
Yeah. And he's really impressed with himself. And he calls this the builder's dream. This is the builder's creed. And he signs it the builder. And he puts that paper in his wallet. And he starts the plans to make this not a cemetery, a memorial park. And something that's not mentioned in any of his biographies or any of the literature about Forest Lawn that you'll find online is that when he took over as manager, racial restrictions get put in place and non-whites are not allowed. And the rule states that no interment of any body or the ashes of any body other than that of a human being of the Caucasian race should be buried there. And even Evelyn Waugh's 1948 novel, The Loved One, which satirizes Forest Lawn, says, "There is no room for the Negro or the Chinaman, however devout. Avowed atheists are welcome, but notorious ill-doers are not." In fact, the novel even has a main character named Amy, who was inspired by Amy Semple McPherson, who we talked about in like our third episode or something. Yeah. But that's another story. I don't want to muddle the narrative. So back to Dr. Garrett, whose wife Lily is buried in Forest Lawn. Is this going to be a problem? Yes.
Yes.
And I'm going to come back to that. But to continue with Hubert's story, one of Hubert's early challenges, and he is a stubborn man, is addressing the myths about cremation. In 1917, he built a crematory when cremation was still a pretty unsettling idea for people. In fact, the first crematory in the U.S. was built just 41 years prior. And in 1917, he begins construction of the first crematorium. So he has to get people on board, and also the Great Mausoleum. And he is really concerned about the aesthetic of the land. So he didn't like the idea of the upright tombstones. because he wants people to look out on just like a vast lawn, rolling hills that are, so it feels like a park, but it's like there's also people that buried here. But people are used to their headstones, right? And they don't want to be told, like, no, you can't put a headstone here. So he just first starts talking to people, trying to, like, sell his, like, oh, they'll have a nice plaque. It'll be great. And people are like, no, I want a headstone, right? He can't get people on board. So he goes to a PR guy. And he talks to this PR guy. He's like, how can I get people on board with the idea of no headstones? And the PR guy's, well, people will do anything for money because that's their main thing. So Hubert says, okay, so I'll give a discount if you waive your rights to a monument.
He was quite a businessman. That's what he was.
Yeah. And he was all about, he wanted the aesthetic a certain way. And so that's how he sold the first lot in America where you were not allowed to put up a headstone.
Wow.
And to give you an idea of just how, like, he has this vision and he is going to have his way, he goes to the Pan Pacific International Exhibition in San Francisco, and he sees this little statue of a baby holding two little baby ducks, and it's a bronze statue, and he loves it, and he's like, I want to buy this for my cemetery. And he goes to the board of the directors, and the board of directors like, you want a statue of a baby holding ducklings at your cemetery? Because they're used to cemeteries as like crying angels and like, saints and all that. And he's like, yeah, because it will symbolize eternal life. Like, that's what it's about. And they're like, no, it's a very heated board meeting. And they're like, no.
And he's manager at this time.
Yeah, he's the manager.
Okay.
And that's a big thing. He's like, okay, I can't get the board to approve this, but in my role as general manager of the cemetery, I have access to funds that let me use those funds for upkeep and maintenance of the property. And so he uses those funds to buy the duck baby.
That's interesting.
And the duck baby at the time costs $886.
That's a lot for back then.
How much do you think that is in today's money?
Oh, that's got to be hundreds of thousands.
$23,891. Yeah, for this. And it's a tiny little bronze statue. It's about yay high and it's in the, I'm saying yay as if this is something that you guys can
see,
visualize, but I'm holding my hand maybe about 3 or 4 feet above the ground. And that's the beginning of his quest to go on this art buying spree. And one of the big things as Forest Lawn will be known for is being about its art museums, about its great artworks, and it's got a lot of little naked baby statues around the pond. But it's got this huge stained glass window of the Last Supper, ginormous
I've heard about
in
that.
the mausoleum. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he's got all these reproductions of these Michelangelo statues, like the Pieta, and they're gorgeous. And he even like had a mask. I don't know if it's a mold made from a sculpture of Moses that was in the Vatican, and he got that put there. And then he has like this there's a whole bunch of different exhibits at the Forest Lawn Museum of like, Matisse and all the great artists, right? And you'll notice that they're all white statues, white paintings, white people in these paintings. This guy, people might be inclined to say, oh, he's just, the whole racial covenant. It's just, that was the time. It's like, well, he's an extremely stubborn man. So he is being extremely stubborn about his art. If he was really like pro everybody, why wouldn't he be extremely stubborn about desegregating and allowing whoever needed to be buried a place to be buried?
No, he was clearly a racist.
Yeah. So let's go back to Dr. Garrett. It's 1922. And remember, Dr. Garrett's wife, Lily, had passed away and was buried at Forest Lawn in 1916. Well, in 1922, this is 5 years after Eaton had taken over, Lily's sister Hattie passes away. And they plan to bury Hattie on the family plot in Forest Lawn. But when Forest Lawn sees her death certificate indicating her race, they refuse to bury her, even though Lily, her sister, was already buried there, and they had already a family plot that they had pre-bought. So they go to court, but Forest Lawn's exclusion based on race is upheld, and Hattie is buried at Angelus Rosedale, which is the first cemetery in LA open to all races, which opened in 1884.
So there was awareness and consciousness in the 1800s.
Yep. Oh. Yeah. And
who knew?
Well, in 1884, this is California, so it wasn't really. I mean, there were still covenants as far as like housing. Like white people were told, like, do not sell your house when you sell your house to black people. There was segregation as far as like swimming pools. Yeah, so it was, I'm not saying like California or LA was all that great. And Glendale is white by design. As I said, the Dr. Garrett, he received threats for being the only black man in
So did he leave
Glendale.
after?
No, he stayed in, for like a while. He stayed in Glendale until 1916. So he stayed there for a while and held out while receiving all those threats and abuses and everything. But so they bury Hattie at Angelus Rosedale. And Rosedale is a really good example of, all the claims that Forest Lawn makes to be like the first to have a crematory, the first to do like the whole idea of like a lawn cemetery, like a memorial park. Angelus Rosedale was doing a lot of that too. So a case could even be made, if someone wanted to look into this, that Eaton got his idea for Forest Lawn from Angelus Rosedale because they had the second crematory in the U.S. in operation, and they started that in 1887. And there was a whole nother similar case with a black woman named Miss Hamilton, whose burial was stopped by Forest Lawn 3 days before her funeral. And they immediately and vigorously fought her case in court. And the reason why I can only assume is because he doesn't want black family members visiting the graves of their black relatives.
Of course.
Because then the white people who are visiting the graves are going to be all upset about that.
It's no different than drinking fountains, restaurants, and buses. It's that.
Disgusting.
Horrible.
And so it would take decades of lawsuits before Forest Lawn would finally allow non-whites to be buried there. But in 1928, Lily's daughter, who's buried at Forest Lawn, passes away, and she can't be buried next to her mother. And so what they actually have to do is they have to exhume Lily from Forest Lawn and then rebury her with her sister and her daughter at Rosedale. And it's like, you already paid for the plot, you already paid for the burial. They don't give a refund. They make them pay the cost to exhume her and then bury her at Rosedale. I actually can't find when non-whites were finally allowed to be buried there, only that it was sometime in the 1960s. But I did find that Nat King Cole was buried in the Great Mausoleum in 1965 while Hubert was still alive. Wow. So Hubert would pass away in 1966.
Isn't it ironic that one of its most famous residents there is Michael Jackson?
Exactly.
That's interesting.
This land where Birth of a Nation was shot, that was bought by racist Hubert Eaton, who decided there's only going to be white people here.
Yeah.
And then finally they get rid of that. And now Michael Jackson's there. It's sad, though, that you can't visit his grave, and understandably because
there's maniac fans. Look what they've done to Jim Morrison.
Well, and there's also maniac, hater, bad people too.
Yeah.
But you can kind of see where you can kind of see the general area. I'm not going to give away on this podcast, but you can look up and you can find out where he is. Back to Hubert, and this is a jarring segue, but this is what this episode is going to be about. It's going to be about the duality of spaces. I love Forest Lawn. I love going there. I love walking around and exploring it. I think it's beautiful, but I also acknowledge that it's a place that was extremely racist and still is, because you have to be extremely rich to afford to be buried there. And so, even though they opened it up and now everyone can be buried there, really, a lot of people don't have access to that because of systemic racism really only lets wealth be accessed by people who are white and who have a history of privilege. And so the people who tend to be buried at Forest Lawn are people who tend to, more likely than not, have a history of privilege. If Forest Lawn wanted to make amends, maybe they could offer discounts to people who aren't white or people who have lower income backgrounds. That would be cool.
It would, but it's a business. And
I know.
It's money in every business, and that's no different.
And death is a huge, huge business. So if this movie were to be a movie, I think the juxtaposition of the dentist just trying to help his family live and die in peace, and then, you know, played by Jacob Anderson, and then Hubert Eaton, who like has this vision. He's this, you know, Missouri Midwestern guy who has this vision, this artful vision, and he's like steadfast in that. And it's a chance to address systemic racism and how it impacts people even in death. And
even in modern times.
Yeah. And even, you know,
today,
the legacy of systemic racism continues as people don't have access to the spaces where they can have peace and visit their loved ones and eternal everything. So in the 1920s, Hubert starts building churches on the property, and these churches are actually places where people get married.
I didn't realize that.
Yes. And from the biography, again, Adele's so funny in her biography. She writes, "Friends were aghast and agog. People got married on flagpoles, in submarines, at Coney Island, but not in a cemetery." And by 1927, 150 weddings had been scheduled for the Little Church of the Flowers. And there's a lot of churches on this property. And in 1940, Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman were married at Wee Kirk of the Heather Church. And Wee Kirk of the Heather is like an old Scottish looking church. And it looks like when you go there, you're like, I'm taken back in time. This is like what the UK looks like. So it's pretty remarkable. And there's a photo of them sitting in the church's wishing chair, which is a stone monument that says, in part, "Good fortune will forever smile upon the bride and bridegroom who sit in this chair on their wedding day." Forest Lawn's wedding coordinator says that in the 40s, if a couple wasn't married in the Wee Kirk Church, they just weren't married. It was an elite place to be married.
That is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Guess that didn't work out that wish for them, did it?
No, that's true.
Didn't hold promises there for them.
And before his death in 1966, Hubert put in a work of art called The Birth of Liberty Mosaic, which is actually at the Hollywood Hills Forest Lawn, basically across the river from where you and I are, Tanya. And I actually went there before this to check it out. It's a 162-foot high mosaic that contains an estimated 5 million pieces of Venetia tile, and it is a mosaic of basically like the signing of the Declaration of Independence and a whole bunch of American history stuff. And there's also a 15-foot high bronze statue of George Washington. It's all very patriotic. When he died, there was a sign there that warned of the dangers of big government and socialism, and which attracted objections. And I wasn't able to check if the sign was still there. I have a feeling it wasn't.
And that's at the Hollywood Hills? Yeah.
Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills. And at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills, they, a few years ago, had a plaza of Mesoamerican culture with like a whole bunch of Aztec religious symbolism and indigenous symbolism and statues and stuff. And that's gone now. And I looked online to try and figure out why they took it away, why it's gone. And I can't find anything. I can just find the parts where they're bragging about having this plaza of Mesoamerican culture. Yeah, so if anyone can find out why they got rid of the plaza of Mesoamerican culture.
Maybe just call and ask for the historical department and say, I'm just curious. I know about it and it's out there, but can't find any reason why it's gone.
Yeah.
And literally ask somebody. Yeah. Sometimes when you can't find research, Google isn't everything. Yeah. Sometimes you need the human touch.
Yeah. Maybe I'll ask. I'll let you guys know if I ever find out what happened to it, but let us know as well. And at the time of his death, the churches at Forest Lawn have seen some 50,000 weddings. And in the 60s, 250,000 were entombed on his various grounds. And now there's like over 380,000 just at Forest Lawn Glendale. I have no idea how many there are at the other.
That property is huge.
Yeah. But
And they're always rebuilding, like new areas and structures. Like living over here and seeing it, it's been going on for years and years where they extend. They must own all of that hill over there.
Yeah. I went there today and there were like at least 7 funerals going on.
Oh, wow.
So they're adding new sites, new memorials, locations, eternal apartments every day. His builder's creed is now engraved on a stone tablet at the entrance to the Great Mausoleum. And Glendale had then continued to remain a sundown town throughout the 1990s. Do you know what a sundown town is?
I do not.
It is a town where Black people are told by the police that they need to either be inside or they need to be outside of the city limits after dark, or else they will face violence and not a good time. And Glendale was that way until through the 1990s. It was a very, very unsafe...
The 1990s?
The 1990s. It was a very unsafe place for Black people. And even in the 1980s, there was a Black family that had a little deli in Glendale. And they eventually had to move because they kept on getting threats and harassment from white people. I mean, a big part is the race restrictive covenants. You know, when white people bought houses in Glendale, they were told you cannot sell this house to a family who's not white.
Horrible.
And so that's how Glendale has maintained its place as like white dominant city, very conservative city. And the KKK and the Nazi Party have been active in this city for decades. And we've seen kind of a crazy explosion of that recently. Like when my book came out in 2021, I gave a talk at Glendale High School and I gave out free gay books. And my whole talk was about how, like, it's important for you to be your authentic self. And it was a very pro-gay talk. And my book is a very gay book. And I gave out gay books to the kids. And so that was all fine and good. And then just like in 2023, there was a Proud Boys rally at Glendale High School, and it was awful. And they're getting people from out of town to come in and be like, we're not going to allow any gay books into our school.
I had somebody that I knew was going to that and were warned, do not go as an LGBTQP ally, because there was advance intel that there was going to be a lot of violence. And so a group that they had gathered together, they all didn't show up.
Oh, no.
Because they were told by other members of their organization
that it was going to be dangerous.
So they did not go.
Oh, God. Yeah. That was awful. That was crazy.
Terrible.
And it was like, oh, my God, we literally have Nazis in our city.
Yeah. But as you said, I do know from knowing this person, there was outside influence and people came in from the outside as well, as what always happens. But the fact is that it fucking happened.
Yeah, and letters to the editor throughout the 20th century in Glendale are, if you do a lot of research, you can find they're openly hostile to the presence of Black, Filipino, or non-white residents or workers. And in 2020, at least we had a little bit of something. City council members voted unanimously to pass a resolution that acknowledged and apologized for and condemned Glendale's past as a sundown town. It was the first city in California to do so. Forest Lawn Glendale does have Black History Month celebration there, so making progress. And Hubert himself is buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, Glendale, in the Great Mausoleum, the Memorial Terrace, room 56. And every day in Los Angeles, 164 people die. That's 60,000 people die every year just in Los Angeles City, not the surrounding county. And death is a very sustainable business. The burial plots themselves are like 5 digits in the minimum. Getting life insurance helps pay for burial costs, but it's very expensive. I did find a Ask Me Anything on Reddit from someone who worked at Forest Lawn, and I'll drop the direct link into the show notes. And this person was a security guard at the Great Mausoleum, And they write, the Great Mausoleum can certainly be creepy. I got lost in it a few times the first weekend I started. I knew every little detail by the time I left, though. I really had a lot of pride for the building, and I consider myself its protector. My favorite thing was to help people find their loved ones. I think someone asked about the molds, the smell. And I've noticed the smell, personally, this is me, I've noticed the smell in the mausoleums have changed. Used to be, you would go in there and you would smell a smell. There would be a certain smell. And maybe sometimes you're told it was like rotted flower water, maybe fresh graves. But now they pump in like a perfume. And so there's a perfume smell that pervades it. But he explains, and on the Jasmine Terrace, there's a carpeted area, and that place smelled like spilled flower water, and they had carpet cleaners come once a month. But during COVID, the COVID bodies were stored in the Little Church of the Flowers on the lower floor behind the Great Hall mortuary. There were 50 plus bodies in there, and at one point, they'd have to count them all alone. And they were just on white plastic folding tables covered by sheets, and the smell of death and the perfumes they used to cover it was unbearable, but you get used to it. Those bodies were slated for cremation because the Little Church's Rosemary Chapel is a crematory. If you ever walk by it and you see black smoke rising from it, that's what's happening there. And I went by and I saw not black smoke, but I saw vapors. The EPA has rules on how many bodies you can cremate in a day because the stuff is poison. The mortuary was overfilled, and they had massive refrigerated trailers that were brought in, and there were just so many dead at the time. The entire industry was overwhelmed. And he goes on to say, I didn't have too many creepy experiences there, unfortunately, even though I tried. The worst was working there at 11:30 at night, 2 nights a week. We had to close all the buildings in the park and get everyone out, and then do truck patrols and foot patrols in the dark. I absolutely hated patrolling the locked gardens on the upper lot in the dark. Depending on how full the moon was, visibility was limited, and the flashlights they provided us would just go out suddenly. I always felt trapped and watched at night in the locked gardens. While doing dispatch one night, I dealt with 2 nighttime break-ins into the park, which was scary because I didn't know if they were just crazy or had a weapon. And we also dealt with coyotes at night. Coyotes. See, that's actually one of the reasons why I'd love to be buried at Forest Lawn Glendale, is I like the idea of coyotes sleeping on my gravesite.
Yes, then they would.
Or peeing on the gravesite. That's fine too. The company and the people all seemed really nice, and they have, from my experience too, they've all been really nice even when they told me to stop doing the things I was doing, which was, by the way...
Yeah, what was that?
Okay, so I didn't know that you weren't allowed to ride your bike on the Forest Lawn Glendale. There are no signs. There's nothing on the website that says you can't ride your bike. And I've done it a couple times, like a bunch of times. And then just this weekend, they said you can't ride your bike here. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. But they were really nice about it. And then the other thing is they've really cracked down on you wandering the mausoleum. So what you do to get into the mausoleum is just give them a name off Find a Grave of like someone that you're there to see. And so I really wanted to go down and see the Azalea Terrace, which is the oldest part of the mausoleum. And so I found a name of someone, and I went down there, and then, I brought that person flowers, and I paid my respects. And then I was just like wandering around the rest of the mausoleum. And
did anybody
which
come
I
out?
always used to do, and it always used to be fine. But when I got to this one part where there was an exit, I heard a voice come over the loudspeaker that said, "Ma'am, you're gonna have to exit here. We don't allow wandering."
Wow.
Yeah.
That was today?
That was yesterday at the Forest Lawn Glendale. Yeah.
Wow. So the cameras were watching?
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of cameras there.
Cameras.
Yeah. And I thought, as long as you're just respectful and cool, all I wanted to do is see the architecture and see all the different spots. And I figured it would be good, like, advertising for them to let people see what the different spaces are like. Because if you're like, oh, I personally really like the corridor of vistas, because it is really pretty. You could see like there's big windows and everything, but they're like, no, you can just go down, see your person, and then leave. Yeah.
Wow, you got caught.
Yeah. But But yeah, definitely check out the Azalea Court Terrace. I also recommend checking out the Corridor of Vistas. And what did I say? Oh, there are no secret rooms in the building. There isn't a time capsule that Hubert Eaton created to be opened in the year 3000.
A time capsule? Is there a rumor about that?
I guess there was. He has lots of plaques. Hubert Eaton does all over the place with his words on them. He's very much a Gemini. He's like, I have things to say, and you go various places, you can see all his plaques. And even though you can't go visit Michael Jackson, if you go to the flower shop and you say you want to buy flowers for Michael Jackson, if you buy them from the flower shop there, they will take that bouquet and put it on his tomb. It's a tomb in a certain part of the mausoleum.
But you can't go to it.
But you can't go to it. Yeah. Yeah. But so that's, if you are a fan and you want to do that, you can do that. And I'll wrap things up by saying there's a whole bunch of media inspired by Forest Lawn. Evelyn Waugh's The Loved One, as I talked about, which is kind of a satire about the death industry, that was published in 1948. And it got made into a film in 1965. In 1985, a Doctor Who serial, Revelation of the Daleks, is inspired by Evelyn Waugh's The Loved One. And Jessica Mitford's 1965 expose called The American Way of Death is about Forest Lawn. And folk singer Tom Paxton made a satirical song called Forest Lawn. Today, Southern Pacific's Tropico Depot has become Metrolink's Glendale station.
No kidding.
Yeah. And my guy who I went to go see in Azalea Terrace, he worked on the railroad. He was a passenger agent, and he actually when he was alive, owned a Craftsman mansion in Pasadena, and his grandchildren lived in it up until the 2000s. And that just shows you, this guy was a passenger agent on the railroad, and he earned enough money to have a Craftsman mansion in Pasadena and a crypt in this mausoleum, which today I'm sure it would probably cost $100,000 to have it there.
Yeah.
And his children got to benefit from having this place to live. His children and grandchildren got to benefit from having this place to live. So it just goes to show you how things have changed, and now how it's just impossible to build wealth anymore.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
It can be.
And that is the story of the Forest Lawn Glendale and Hubert Eaton and its complicated past.
It is a complicated past.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought?
I used to be a cremation type of person. Reading about the pollution, I'm like, maybe the idea of being buried without being embalmed first in like a degradable coffin so that like my body can just decompose into the earth. That might be the way to go. Do you have preference?
I don't do thinking on these subjects.
Okay, you don't?
I do not. No, I work hard to just stay in the living. Yeah, I don't think about that. I don't want to think about that. Yeah, it's just,
The idea of coyotes laying on my grave makes
that
me
part's
happy.
cool.
Yeah.
That part's cool.
I have a lot of animal ashes. I have my horse got cremated, my 2 dogs, my duck, and a cat that I found.
Wow.
So at some point, something has to be done with those ashes.
Yeah.
Maybe scattered somewhere.
Right, that's the beautiful thing, I think.
Anyway, fascinating death stuff. Anything you're working on, looking forward to?
Just staying quiet between Christmas and New Year's, which is such a weird time. I just crack up at all the memes I'm seeing, like December 26th to January 30th. Like, what day is it? Am I dressed? And I'm full of cheese. Like everybody's just sluggish and kind of like, what about you? You're still on vacation, so.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm using vacation to write as much as I can for the podcast and edit and pre-schedule as many podcasts as I can so that when I get back to work, if I have a really busy week, I don't have to stress about it.
Yeah.
So that is it for today. I do have more exciting graveyard stories. I have another graveyard story that I haven't written yet, but I'm really excited about. And I have an asylum story. That's fun as well.
Did you watch Ryan Murphy's Asylum?
No.
You need to watch that.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it. I'll check it.
I'm not going to say it. I mean, great acting. It's disturbing AF.
Yeah.
But, That was what, the second in his series of American Horror Stories? I think second or third. Yeah, it's pretty cuckoo bananas. But man, the acting is great in that.
Cool.
Yeah, it'll disturb you.
Yeah. This asylum story is actually, there's something extremely wholesome about it. And
You don't hear that too much.
Yeah, it leaves you with a little bittersweet feeling.
Wow.
So I'll look forward to sharing that with you soon. Until next time, follow us on Instagram at Haunted Hollywood Hour. Be sure to give us a subscribe so that you can be notified whenever there's a new episode. Till next time. Bye.